I mean, we're kind of circling around the similar discussion. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, she's facing criticism for her decision to only grant interviews to reporters of color on the 2-year anniversary of her inauguration. So Lightfoot said in a letter that it's unacceptable that in a city where approximately 2/3 of residents are people of color, that the press corporation does not reflect, the press corps does not reflect the population. So what is your reaction to this gesture that she's done?
Oh boy, she's really done it, right? Like, I love this story because it has just exploded in both, on the one side, criticism of this move, and then on the other side, a lot of praise. And speaking on the praise side, there is a newspaper by the name of the Chicago Crusader, and they represent a lot of Black-owned businesses in Chicago, which they claim is still the most segregated city in all of America. And they say Black media's vantage point is often different than mainstream. Our niches represent authentic voices of diverse Black audiences who are often seen with a stereotypical lens. Too often, white coverage focuses on violence, deprivation, and negative behavior, which represents a small percentage of Chicago's Black community, yet dominates news coverage. And yet, on the other side, the National Organization of Black Journalists, they've actually come out and said, we're against this move by Mayor Lightfoot. And so you have, even within the Black community, two takes on this. I think she's bringing up a really interesting point. If you have
Why are people against it, Mel?
Why are they against it? Oh, because they don't believe that a politician is supposed to ask or determine who is supposed to interview them. And so, in other words, she's not necessarily, they like the gesture. They stand behind what she says, which is that in Chicago in particular, it's still very white and it's still very male. There's not one woman of color who has been assigned to the City Hall beat. There's a great example, and this is the first Black lesbian mayor in all of America, and there's not one woman of color who's been assigned to cover her. I find that really interesting. So they say that the gesture, while they appreciate it, it is not up to her and her role to dictate to the press what they should and should not do. And so that's their stance, although they do support her as a person.
Oh, it's a great stance. It's a great stance, though. Black journalists are standing up for the principles of journalism, which is that the subject should not be able to dictate which journalists cover them. It's not her responsibility. So it is the Black journalists who are upholding journalistic integrity, whereas other journalistic outlets may not be upholding journalistic integrity by not providing a journalistic lens that is fully representative of all stories. It's putting the responsibility on the outlets, like the actual people who run the media. I mean, maybe her gesture isn't the perfect one, but it is calling out a discrepancy in terms of who's covering the stories in whose communities and why. So I love that the National Journalists of Association of Black Journalists is actually the one upholding the principle of journalism. When, let's face it, I mean, there are a lot of other organizations, especially some who've been making headlines lately, who don't necessarily been following that ethos.
No.
Yeah, I think for this mayor, it would be different if she were like an open book 365 days of the year. And she was, making this point of saying, this one day, I'm only going to let Black journalists interview me. But the way I'm understanding this story is that she is not forthcoming and not very open with journalists when they ask sort of hard-hitting questions about policy and about making change. And she kind of avoids them. And a reporter put it best at the end of this Washington Post piece, saying, thanks for having a pro-Black journalist day, but we need more pro-Black policies that will help Black people in Chicago 365 days of the year.
Yeah,
it's also just like
to her.
I was just going to say, it's just a bit of a, obviously in this instance, there's some interesting things happening, but we think back not that long ago when Trump was in power, again, a politician who was sort of cherry picking which journalists could come and be a part of, like, asking him questions. He would, routinely, reportedly move, like, CNN reporters to the back. We know that he treated a lot of people differently. He only really liked to answer questions from journalists that asked him questions that he felt were nice. And so I do think, like, you could see how easily this kind of an idea, in this case, it's well-meaning. In other hands, I think it could become quite problematic. Don't you think?
I do. I mean, but I do put myself in her shoes As I said earlier, she's the first Black lesbian mayor of any city in America. And she tweeted about her decision to do this. And she started by tweeting saying, "This is an imbalance that needs to change. Chicago is a world-class city. Our local media should reflect the multiple cultures that comprise it." And then she followed it up with one more tweet saying, "We must be intentional about doing better. I believe that when running for office, I stand for this belief now. It's time for the newsrooms to do better and build teams that reflect the makeup of our city." I did a quick scroll on the replies to her tweets. You can imagine female politicians, we know they get it the worst on trolling on social media. Now she's a Black woman. She's also a lesbian. If you don't think that she has gotten a hugely unfair deal with how the press covers her, just do yourself a favor and go through the replies to people chirping back at her because of this decision. There is a serious problem with misogyny, with homophobia, with racism, just to her tweets to try for one time to try to even out the playing field. So I feel like just in the response to this, we see the problem that she is exactly talking about in all of this.